Good evening. You'll notice that I'm not Mark Urban. I'm Neil Quilliam. I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at Chatham House in the Middle East and North Africa program. So I'm very pleased to welcome you to this evening's event, Iraq, Fragile Progress. It'll be very interesting to see what that progress, in fact, entails, and I'm sure our speakers tonight will allude to that in one way or another. Just a few housekeeping points. For this evening, the event's going to be on the record. It's going to be live streamed via the website to members. If you wish to comment via Twitter, please use hashtag #CHEvents. If I could ask you to put your phones on silent or turn them off, that would be very helpful for the flow of the evening. I'm just going to say just a few quick words, but nothing too substantive about our two speakers, so we can actually launch straight into their talks. They're going to be talking for about 13 or 14 minutes each, and then that should leave us with about 30 minutes for conversation and questions. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ziad Alaaldin, who is a senior advisor at IDEA. He was a legal advisor to the UN in Iraq between 2005 2010. And on my left, we have Ranj Alaaldin, who is a visiting scholar at Columbia University. He is also a doctoral researcher at the LSE, and he looks into Shia mobilization and has spent a lot of time in Iraq and has carried out extensive research there. So if we can just kick off, I'll hand straight over to Ziad, and we've got about 13 or 14 minutes to talk about fragile progress.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the organizers for organizing this event. I'll get straight to it. What is happening and what is wrong with Iraq today? As you know, you've been following the news, violence has surged over recent months to levels not seen for years. Large swaths of the country are now outside of government's control. And in recent days, we're starting to get more reports about the types of violence that we haven't seen since 2006 and 2007. Beheadings, so on and so forth, recurring now almost on a daily basis once again, things that we have not seen for years. Now, the type of violence and the conflict that's now taking place in Fallujah and in Anbar is very difficult to follow, and no one knows exactly, for now, how it's going to turn out. But what we do know is that none of this is happening in a vacuum. Apart from the obvious impact of the conflict in Syria, which has transformed the border region between Iraq and Syria into an even more lawless area than it was previously, with smuggling taking place on a daily basis. We have human rights abuses that have been taking place at an alarming level since 2003, but increasing even more so now, with groups of people at a time being arrested for no good reason, detained without charge for days, weeks, months, sometimes even longer, subjected to brutal treatment in detention. If they're ever brought to court, and if they're lucky enough to have been found not guilty, then often they're even kept in detention illegally in violation of court orders, merely so that the guards can extract bribes. Women are subjected to sexual harassment, to rape, at alarming levels in Iraq today. The due process requirements and guarantees that are contained in the Constitution are totally ignored. Corruption, as you know, is completely out of control. It was described in 2006 as the second insurgency. And yet, it's been close to 10 years, and the anti-corruption framework that exists today in Iraq, the legal framework that is supposed to protect our public monies from corruption and from embezzlement, is almost exactly what it was in 2005 and 2006. Almost no changes have taken place. And the few changes that have taken place are really insignificant. Nowhere near the type of reform that one would expect, given the billions of dollars that have disappeared in thin air. Services, as you know, are completely non-existent. Electricity, healthcare, education. Now the environment is collapsing at an alarming rate, leading to dust storms, hundreds of dust storms a year, and now, 2 years in a row, debilitating floods that have destroyed billions of dollars of property. Riots and the torching of government offices are now commonplace, especially in the south of the country, and especially during the summer months. Even worse, the combination of all this is the use of what's referred to in Iraq as the magic wands, which you may have heard of, which is the useless bomb detectors that Jim McCormick, a former British police officer who is now serving 10 years in jail, the maximum penalty for fraud, for having sold useless bomb detectors which do not function to the Iraqi government to the tune of tens of millions of pounds. Those devices today, despite the fact that Jim McCormick has now been arrested and convicted of fraud for the sale of these useless devices, those devices are still in use throughout Iraq today. When confronted about the use of these devices, the Prime Minister said that in fact they did work, that the court decision was wrong, that they worked, that the problem was not the devices, the problem was that the police officers and soldiers were not properly trained in their use. Finally, sectarianism has not improved but worsened in Iraq since 2003. It is the worst indictment of the system of government and the occupation and the election system, that sectarianism and the people's willingness to live together has gone worse over time and not better. People in 2003 were much more willing to be forgiving and to live together than they are today. And what is the cause? Rather than seek to improve their performance, rather than admit failure, government officials scandalously resort to sectarianism on a daily basis to protect themselves from criticism in the most vulgar way possible. If I had more time, I would show you examples. What I would invite you to do is to research the phenomenon online. All this is taking place against the backdrop of government that is almost never held accountable for its actions, or inactions, as the case may be. How did this come to pass? Now, there are different starting points. I trace this to the manner in which the Constitution was drafted and to its content. Now, there's an official narrative as to how the Constitution was drafted, an official and accepted narrative. The official narrative is that elections took place in January 2005. The elected representatives of the people drafted a constitution through a drafting committee, and that constitution was put to a referendum in October 2005 and was accepted by 80% of the population. That is the official narrative. There is an untold story about how the constitution was actually drafted, and it's much more sinister. Is that the drafting committee that was putting together the draft was essentially dissolved in August 2005 in violation of the rules and replaced by a shadowy group of people whose identity, for the most part, is still not known today. This group of people wrote the most salient parts of the Constitution, namely the federal system of government. The federal system of government was not drafted by the people who were elected in January 2005. It was drafted in secret and behind closed doors. And what did the federal system of government provide? It provided for a federal system in which regions and provinces were far, far more powerful than the central government, and in which the central government had essentially no power. No power to raise taxes, no power over airspace, no power over agriculture, no power over education, etc., etc., etc. A central government essentially devoid of all sources of income and devoid of any power. The good news is that after the Constitution entered into force and after the following elections, there was a widespread agreement amongst the political class that the Constitution could not be implemented, that the system of government, the federal system of government, apart from the Kurdistan region, could not be implemented in the rest of the country. The bad news is that that left us with no rules according to which our system of government could function. Without a constitution in place that was being applied willingly by the political class, we were left with no rules. Now, every system of government and every constitutional system depends on, for its success, the political class, its goodwill and its capability and its capacity in order to implement the text. Without that type of goodwill and capacity, then necessarily implementation will be a failure. In our case, we were even more at the mercy of our political class, given that we did not have a functioning constitution in place, a constitution that the political class was willing to implement. So the question becomes, who were these people? Who were these political elites? What was their willingness and what was their capacity like? The answer to that question is that for the most part, our political elites were formed in exile, spent decades without meaningful employment, spent decades being schooled in the art of deceit and in conspiracy, were involving themselves in failure after failure in their futile effort to remove a single individual from power, Saddam Hussein. They were also very adept at engaging in moral compromise, a very important point. Moral compromise, almost a prerequisite to be involved in the occupation effort after 2003. More principled Iraqis either refused to participate in government, were pushed out, or disappeared. You may argue that the Iraqis chose these leaders, because after all, we did have elections on several occasions since 2005. I would respond that we never had any choice. That by 2005, these individuals, our ruling elites, had been in power for 2 years, had already had the benefit of decades of assistance from the United States, from the United Kingdom, from Iran, from Gulf countries. National elites, people who were stuck in the country, never had any hope. During the 2 years, from 2003 to 2005, in which these political elites were in power, they had access to money, to privilege, to visibility, and to weapons. Any group of people that sought to challenge these individuals in a free and fair election would never stand any chance. So what is the solution? Is it revolution, coup d'etat, civil war? None of those appear to be convincing outcomes for Iraq, neither desirable in the current outcome or feasible or realistic. Elections, the current system is rigged in the favor of the current group who are ruling the country. The best outcome that we could hope for is that Nouri al-Maliki, our current prime minister, will not return for a third term. If that were to be the case, then at least we would have a chance at a new dynamic that will allow for some type of outcome, some type of negotiation to resolve our situation. But even if that were to come to pass, then the rest of the ministers who would be in government would in any event be derived from the same group of elites. So therefore, the same methods, the same sectarianism, the same levels of corruption. So what are we left with? The only possible option, at least in the near to medium outcome, to the medium term, is civil society. Now, civil society has had some measure of success in Iraq over the past few years. That success includes changes to the electoral law that took place in 2010. Those changes, the improvements, I won't discuss them in detail, but improvements were made in 2010 solely at the insistence of civil society, including political leaders and religious leaders, not political parties, forces outside the political parties. They insisted on the change, and Parliament felt obligated to implement those changes. Reconciliation initiatives. After the reduction of violence in 2008, you had civil society organizations throughout the country organized at their own initiative, reconciliation initiatives throughout, from 2008 to 2011. Hundreds of events took place. Demonstrations relating to the Arab Spring in some part, and also in relation to electricity supply, were organized regularly throughout the country and organized by civil society in an organized fashion. And also the success in relation to MPs' benefits. Some of you may know that MPs in Iraq earn extraordinary amounts of money. And the only reason why this is being debated and being discussed nationally is because of the insistence by civil society. Civil society has had some success, albeit in a larger scope of things, perhaps not so significant, but has had some success in forcing issues to be on the national agenda. So the solution, insofar as I'm concerned, if there can be a solution to our current problem, is to create a national agenda for reform through civil society that would impose itself on the political class. And that would happen through civil society organizations, through religious organizations. All would sign up and all would force the political parties to debate the issues in a serious fashion. And even if only 5% of the agenda were implemented eventually, that in and of itself would be a far greater measure of success than anything that's happened over the past 10 years. That's all I'll say for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zaid. Some very sobering thoughts, but also a little ray of hope, I guess, maybe from that. If I could turn straight over to you, Ranj.
Thanks very much,
share your thoughts
Kyle,
on this.
and thanks to Chatham House for having me here. Zaid focused primarily on Iraq's constitution, laws, regulations, and kind of looked at the constitution as the root of Iraq's problems today. And of course, against this backdrop, discussed Iraq's politics and problems. I'd like to focus primarily, if not entirely, on the political context, the political realities, the social realities that I think underpin Iraq's problems today, its challenges and the challenges it will face in the future. I've had the benefit of reading Zaid's book, which is slightly unfair perhaps, but essentially in the book, and kind of like his presentation, there is an emphasis on the present and the future. But what's missing, I thought, is the past, because it's easy to forget sometimes that the new Iraq, the so-called new Iraq, emerged after 30 years of dictatorship, a dictatorship that brutally suppressed its people, which waged war on its neighbors, but also a dictatorship which continues to influence the Iraqi society and state today. Put in other words, I think it's important to look at pre-03 Iraq as well as post-03 Iraq when analyzing and appraising the country. And I'd like to focus particularly on the issue of sectarianism, principally because it is in my opinion, the most influential and significant of Iraq's problems in terms of its impact on state and society. And there is this conception that sectarianism emerged after '03, that it was an American creation, when in fact it was an Iraqi creation which emerged from the late 1950s, late 1960s onwards, and which was, of course, exacerbated by regional events like the Iranian Revolution, the Iran-Iraq War, and of course the domestic event, the 1991 uprising. And that's perhaps why I disagree with Zaid when he refers to, or kind of submits the notion that Iraq's current ruling elite were parachuted into Iraq, into power, given that parties like the Islamic Dawah Party, like ISKI, like the Kurds even, given that they have extensive ties to their respective communities, to their respective constituencies. And you'll notice that I didn't mention any Sunnis there, Shia and Kurd only, and that's mainly because in the pre-03 Iraq, the Sunni identity was primarily manifested in the state, the Iraqi state itself. In other words, that the Sunnis were, if you want to put it, sectless, let's say. But of course, that's kind of changing now in the post-03 Iraq, and it's something we can discuss in the Q&A, the question of Sunni mobilization, that is. So why does all this matter? Why does it matter that Iraq had sectarianism before 2003? Well, for two reasons. Number one, I think it's significant because it means that the Iraqi state had no choice but to be defined by sectarian mobilization, by identity politics. In other words, it had no choice. The political process had no choice but to be defined by identity politics. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that identity politics or the mobilization of Sunni and Shia communities had to be violent, had to translate into violent conflict, because the Shia and the Kurds contest politics in Iraq on the basis of their identities, yet the two haven't come to blows like the Sunni and the Shia have. And of course, different identities make for pluralistic societies, pluralistic democratic processes. So the question here is, why was there a war between the Sunni and the Shia communities? Of course, it's a complicated issue, and certainly not the 10 minutes that I have certainly wouldn't do the debate justice. But again, we can kind of go into it during the Q&A session. But firstly, I'd argue that there's a link between the post-03 violence and the Sunni Arab decision to reject the new Iraq and the new constitution. The Sunni Arabs were led by the Sunni Arab elite, who actually today are the ones who most often make references to the Iraqi constitution as the basis of their criticisms and their arguments. Secondly, because elements of the Sunni community chose to boycott peaceful means through which to negotiate with their Iraqi counterparts. Civil war also took place because underpinning this post-03 mobilization of the Sunnis, there was a myth, perhaps one of the greatest myths about post-03 Iraq, namely that the Sunnis were marginalized and disempowered, which simply wasn't the case. And even today, Iraq's problems and challenges gets reduced to this idea that the Sunnis were marginalized, are being suppressed, I think it was about a month ago that an analyst or a scholar, I can't quite remember, compared the situation of the Sunnis in Iraq to the civilian population in Syria. And as a side note, what I really recommend is that researchers head to Washington, the National Defense University, because what you'll see there is that the post-03 Sunni insurgency was in fact a pre-planned enterprise. So the Ba'ath regime, as the Ba'ath regime secret files and intelligence reports show over in Washington, they had a plan to initiate an insurgency straight after the toppling of the former regime, and this kind of exacerbated the situation, and then and this more or less opened up the space for foreign and domestic jihadists to enter the country, and which more or less took the country to the brink. I'd also say that this, so Zaid in his book, if I remember correctly, you mentioned that the Sunnis rejected the intervention and the political process from the outset. But in fact, what this rejection did is mobilize the Shias like they have never been before. So a traditionally divided Shia community, divided along political, tribal, ideological lines, were mobilized and unified to contest power in the Iraqi state like they have never before, because of the fears, the uncertainties that the Sunni Arab rejection introduced. And this brings me to Anbar, the ongoing conflict in Anbar, because I think what both Zaid and I have been talking about is the lack of a unified vision in Iraq, or a lack of a unified Iraqi identity. And all this is relevant in the context of the Anbar conflict, because Anbar wasn't, the conflict wasn't the result of Prime Minister Maliki's actions in terms of dismantling the protest sites or targeting individual Sunni politicians. They were certainly triggered by those actions, but I'd say they're simply the result of the post-03 climate, the 2006-2007 civil war, which never really ended, and Anbar is simply an extension of that conflict, because that was many interpretations of that conflict is that it kind of ended, one side won, the Shia, one side lost, the Sunni, which is of course a very simplistic analysis, but it never really ended. More so is the fact, I'd say, that the Sunnis, or the Sunni Arab militants, took the tactical decision to retreat, and the Shia side, again simplifying these terms, Sunni and Shia, the Shia side, rather than defeating their opponents, far from that, they've only really managed to contain the violence and the military operations emanating from various sections of the Sunni community. And what does this mean for the future? Well, it means that conflict can be contained, but I think there will be more Anbari kind of conflicts in Iraq. There will be many more conflicts similar to the Anbar conflict in the future, perhaps elsewhere in the province, and one of the greatest fears is that the conflict in Anbar elsewhere could engulf the broader country and then repeat the 06-07 civil war, which would again take Iraq back to the brink, and perhaps in a way in which it can't really recover from, like it has done over the past 5 or 6 years. So in conclusion, I disagree with the argument that the problems Iraq has can be fixed by the constitution, simply because of the deep-rooted animosities and competing visions for the future. And what Zaid more or less suggested requires respect for the constitution. Let's say even if you had the perfect constitution tomorrow, that still requires certain adherence to the constitution, but that requires reconciliation, which requires unity. And for me, that's just too ambitious at this point, and therefore Iraq has to work with what it has. And in many respects, you could say the Iraqi political process is reflective of the society itself, not necessarily in terms of divisions between individuals, as in Sunnis and Shias. Sunnis and Shias have historically lived together. There is no dispute about that, but rather about the uncertainties in that integration might come at the expense of one side or the other. I believe violence can be contained, but not eliminated, especially because of the conflict in Syria, which has given militants in Iraq the momentum, and they are likely to look to capitalize on that. On Maliki, I'd suggest caution about calling for the removal of Iraq's single most popular politician. We'll come to that. Because we've seen in the region elsewhere the ramifications of calling for a democratically elected leader can have. At the same time, calling for the wholesale removal of the regime, kind of rewriting Iraq from the outset. Again, very dangerous, because that essentially means you'd be taking the country back to a transitional phase. And we saw what that transitional phase entailed after 2003. Iraq needs realistic proposals, and I think there is a tendency to call for a stronger state, a centralized state, but then at the same time, proponents of a centralized, stronger Iraqi state call for the removal of a leader that they argue has had or displayed authoritarian tendencies, which is a contradiction, in my opinion. Decentralized power, perhaps even federalism, might be the solution, possibly the solution for Iraq. And we've seen the idea gain support by local actors on the ground, particularly in the Sunni northwest. And that in turn, I think, will allow for some breathing space to emerge, the breathing space that Iraq needs and Iraqis need as a people to kind of reconcile their differences, to try and forge some kind of unified Iraqi identity. Without that breathing space, this won't be possible. Finally, the past 2 years, for me, has been a remarkable restraint on the part of the Shia community, because we've seen the number of times that Shia political and clerical leaders, most notably Ayatollah Sistani, they've come out in condemnation against sectarian killings, political violence. Whereas when I'm speaking to Iraqi Shias, particularly from Najaf, they're always asking me, where is the equivalent from the Sunni Arab community? And it doesn't exist at the moment, which is very important, especially because of the conflict in Syria, which has, again, exacerbated these divisions. And I'm also always reminded of the fact that in places like Anbar, and I believe in Mosul as well, the Saddam-era flag still flies. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We've had two very clear perspectives there, and I suspect that we could almost open up the conversation between our two speakers. But before I allow that possibly to happen at some stage, we'll sort of throw questions out to the floor. Before we start taking questions, I should just say that there will be a sort of reception on the main floor as you leave, so we can continue conversation sort of over drinks. Anyway, if you would like to raise your hand, we'll take one question at a time. If you can wait for the roving mic, that would be great. Give your name and affiliation, that would be much appreciated. Thank you very much. Great. Can we just take a question down here? Great. Thank you.
I'll try and keep it short. William Patey, British ambassador to Iraq during 2005-2006 when the constitution was being drafted, and an occasional participant in the constitutional negotiations. I just want to take issue with Zaid on the constitution being drafted in secret and with a shadow committee who nobody knew who they were. Everyone knew who they were. And the constitutional provisions were well debated. The problem was there wasn't a consensus and there wasn't agreement. There isn't a national consensus, and I think that comes through in what the two speakers are saying. There was debates over the degree to which federalism could be conceded and the degree to which centralisation. If you concede a degree of autonomy to the Kurds, was it not legitimate to give it to any other provinces? So there were unresolved issues in the constitution. Indeed, most of the problem is many of the issues were left to be decided by law. And if I have one regret, is that was the thinking decided by law actually solves something, because there's never been any consensus on what the laws should be. So there is great ambiguity in the constitution. The constitution is a document. It will never give you the basis you need unless there is some sort of national consensus, if there is some attempt at pluralism. And I agree with you, civil society needs to express itself. I used to say when I was there, elections and the rule of law, these are all important components of democracy, but unless you have a vibrant civil society, you can't really have a democratic democratic system. So, I mean, all I would say is what I think is required is a bit more pluralism. I think they're a bit kind to the Shia elite here in terms of why the constitution is not working. I think equating, I think one of the problems I saw when I was there was equating all Sunnis with Baathists. And leaving the De-Baathification Commission as part of the constitution was a huge mistake. I think the same mistake is being made now in equating all Sunnis with Al-Qaeda. And I think that is part of the problem. The Sunnis are becoming alienated. The moderate Sunnis feel alienated from the system. And I think when your political leaders are driven into exile in Turkey and arrested, it makes life difficult. So I think there's a bit of a need for some pluralism and for a bit of understanding that because you win the elections and because you have power, you do have a responsibility to the minorities. And I think that is the big ask of the Shia. Can you have power and also reach out to the Sunnis? And I think that's the big challenge for Iraq. I'm sorry, that wasn't a question.
That's all right. That's all right. Would either of you like to come back?
Just briefly. I mean, we have different views about this. I mean, obviously, you don't think that that was a shadowy group because you were in that group. So obviously, I mean, with all due respect, the vast majority of Iraqis do not know that the British ambassador was involved in negotiating the Iraqi constitution. The vast majority of the Iraqis do not know that. You know? Okay, they know now. It would come as a great surprise to them. Okay, it would come as a great surprise to the vast majority of Iraqis that the 275 individuals that they elected in January 2005 were not the people who drafted the constitution. That in fact the British ambassador, the American ambassador.
They were the people who drafted the constitution. We were trying to mediate between them.
Sure. Okay. Once again, we have a different opinion about that. And also, once again, I have all the drafts of the Iraqi constitution. I'm one of the few people that's kept all the drafts. If you trace the evolution of the drafts from June to August 2005, you can mark a clear evolution in the ideas of the drafters. And then from August 2005 onwards, which is when you and your colleagues stepped in, everything changed very, very suddenly. It's clear in the drafts, and I set everything out in chapter 3 of my book. I think I'm the first person to have done so. I took a great deal of effort, and the marked change in tone in the Constitution from June to August, and then from August onwards, is really remarkable, and it's undeniable, frankly. Okay? So to argue that it was all the Iraqis, they were doing it, and that you were negotiating, helping them negotiate it, we have a difference of opinion. I think I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks.
I think the issue here is one of expectation. So I'm going to come to the defense of the ambassador here. Because, so what were the objectives when you're trying to draft a constitution in a war zone, essentially, and you managed to organize a referendum after that? 4 out of 5 Iraqis voted for it. And I know, Zaid, in your book, you dismissed that argument because you say Iraqis didn't actually read the constitution and they didn't have enough time. But even on this question of reading the constitution, I think what of the argument that you have the representatives of these communities seated at the table? Now, if you disagree that they are or were the representatives, then fine, that's a different issue altogether. But if we accept that they were representative of their respective communities, and then that kind of, deals with the issue of Iraqis not having read the constitution or having more time, and even the question of time. I mean, how much time is appropriate for a country in the transitional phase? What is even the perfect constitution? I think that's the challenge here. What would have been the ideal constitution? Especially when one particular community was, or some segments of this particular community were dead set on undermining anything that was to be proposed in the new Iraq.
Can I just say just very quick remark? Sure. Is that the vast majority of the representatives of the Shia community, not the Sunni community, the Shia community, the vast majority of them, immediately after the Constitution entered into force, clearly came out and said, we reject the Constitution. Okay? Only one political party, which was the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution of Iraq, which at the time was led by Abdelaziz Hakim, supported the federal system of government in the Constitution. All the others, including the Dawah Party, including the Cedrists, which at the time was the major force in the Shia community, all came out immediately afterwards in February 2006 and said, we reject the Constitution, we do not accept federalism, we do not accept. One last issue is that earlier you suggested that I was arguing in favor of centralism and so on and so forth. That's absolutely not the case.
In your book you are?
No, in my book you'll see, in my book if you reread the final chapter.
Great, thanks, gents. Can we put the questions back out to the floor, please? Next question, please. Over here, thank you very much.
I'm Samira Kawar, Middle East editor at Argus Media. We are an energy publishing
Sorry, could you
house.
put the microphone closer to your mouth?
Sorry, I'm from Argus Media. We're an energy publishing house. And my question is actually to both the speakers. Given that now we have a federal system, which may be contested to some degree, but how do you see the division of resources, given that some areas are now getting a percentage, it's a low percentage of oil revenues. I think it's now been agreed at $5 per barrel of crude that's refined and produced, or produced and refined. Given the fact that Anbar has very few resources at the moment, we've got most of the resources concentrated in southern Iraq, and there are some resources, obviously, they're growing, oil resources and gas resources in Kurdistan, and those are the subject of a big, shall we say, argument or debate or even disagreement at the moment. But nevertheless, they have those resources. Anbar doesn't have anything at the moment. It may have gas if exploration is allowed. But how would the resources of Iraq be divided and shared equally, given this federal setup at the moment? Thank you.
I mean, I'll let the constitutional expert answer the constitutional aspect, and then I can discuss the political.
The revenue is divided in different ways in Iraq. So the first issue is the central government has its funds that it derives from oil resources and the tiny bit of tax money that it gets from customs and duties. That money is distributed, part of it is distributed to the provinces and to the regions that produce oil. What's left afterwards is allocated on a per capita basis to each province. So Anbar does get a lot of revenue, just like all the other provinces do. The problem isn't that there isn't enough funds. The problem is that those funds that are available are either not spent or are stolen. It's always been the way. So now, for example, Basra province is going to get a lot more, at least according to the new decentralization law or the amended decentralization law. It's going to get a lot more revenue because it's going to get $5 per barrel, so on and so forth. But the problem with Basra has never been a lack of funds because they never spend their full budget. They never spend it. And what money is spent often just disappears. Okay? So the problem isn't lack of funds. The problem is oversight. The problem is corruption, embezzlement, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I more or less agree with that. I mean, Anbar itself, I think it was last year that they signed a deal with a Korean company. I can't quite recall. It does have gas reserves. And Salahuddin province, this was also last year. It was reported by Iraq Oil Report, even went about to establish its own oil ministry, completely independent of Baghdad, which was completely ridiculed at the time. This was reported on, but I think there are efforts to expand or build on what energy reserves it does have.
Thank you. Next question. Yes, please. Okay, we get a microphone over here, please. Just at the second row, thank you.
Since Abbas, I'm Iraqi Turkmen representative to UK. My question is coming back to the drafted constitution. In the constitution, it's not just federalism and the other issues that's created the conflict. The biggest issue, I think, is the disputed area. And this disputed area between Kurds and Arabs, which is mostly constituted from the Turkmen, I would like to draw your attention to what's happening in Tuz Khurmatu town. Tuz Khurmatu town is majority Turkmen, and because of this agreement between central government and Kurdistan, what's happening, the Kurdish government, they don't allow the central government to be involved to protect the town. At the same time, the Kurds themselves, they are not protecting the town. So they left the town to be subjected to the daily terror attacks. So just even on daily basis or every other day, there is bomb attack or explosive or the suicide bombers killing tens and injuring even more. So I don't know, what's your opinion about regarding that? Is there going to be any change regarding this area? Is it going to be these people to be protected in the future? Thank you.
I mean, I think the minority issue has been sidelined over the past 5 years, certainly. So minorities aren't getting enough. No, in general. So the Turkmen are a minority in Iraq as a whole, right? Like the Christians and so forth. Oh, no, I mean, the point I'm making is that the minority issue has been sidelined. So at the moment, it's primarily Sunni and Shia. It's Anbar And then, of course, the Kurds come into that as well, but they're kind of going about their own business whilst Arab Iraq is almost exploding. But I think the minority issue has been sidelined in the broader debates, which is unfortunate. That's my opinion.
I don't really have anything to add to that other than it's a great tragedy, and I realize that this tragedy exists, and I don't think there's going to be any improvement in the short term. I really don't think so, because the people who are in charge don't have the patience for it and aren't interested. That's my personal opinion.
Thank you. Do you have any more questions out there? Yes, please, gentlemen in the front row. Thank you.
Yusuf Al-Khoui, Al-Khoui Foundation. On the sectarianism issue, how much do you think that the Sunnis of Iraq feel they are the founders of modern Iraq, and the change of balance of power in Iraq is something a lot of them haven't really psychologically accepted? And how much do you think is the ambassador mentioned that Sunni Shias call them Qaeda, but some of their leaders call themselves Qaeda, like Harith al-Dhari, who says, I am a supporter of Qaeda. And we have a lot of Sunnis from Anbar and now refugees in Karbala and Najaf. So what I actually see is this global extremist vision of Sunni Islam, if you like, which has been hijacked by certain states, is the same problem in Iraq. Is not really so much Sunni Shia, is more of like extremists who are using religion from one end and extremists from the other end being the reaction to it. And I don't know how this can be resolved, especially when this has become a power struggle between Saudi and Iran, and how we could sort of break this deadlock. So I would really appreciate your views on this.
I mean, it's impossible, obviously, to gauge the perception of the Sunni community at large. There's a difference between perception and reality. That is, whether the Sunni community see themselves as a marginalized community. Even if they're not, but they perceive it to be so, then that's equally significant. But in the long run, I think the point was made earlier on by the ambassador, about the moderate Sunni voices. I think they're the ones who need to be empowered more, lest the extremist elements are given a chance to consolidate their hold, to expand their influence. And I think that's probably a good place to start. But I was speaking to an official not so long ago who told me at the moment there are many moderate voices and moderate Sunni leaders, but there isn't a single one or two that you can deal with and who are influential enough to, let's say, make a difference. But I think the empowerment of moderate voices is the best place to start.
What I would say is, I generally agree with what Ranj just said, but what I would say is that from 2008 to 2011, when violence was still, when it had decreased from the high levels of 2007 and before it started increasing again, I spent a lot of time visiting tribal areas, farmland areas, very disaffected areas, where people are very, very poor, where you would expect them to be very resentful of the changes that are taking place. And to my great surprise, I found that they were all very optimistic about the future, and that they were all very happy at their situation, and they had no problem with al-Maliki personally. And many of them even said, in these poor, disaffected Sunni areas, that they were even prepared to vote for al-Maliki at the time, because they considered him to be, someone who had reestablished security, someone who was probably a national leader, although they didn't agree with everything that he'd done and said. So generally, he was fine. Okay. That goodwill was deliberately ruined, deliberately destroyed, on both sides. I'm focusing just because in your question, you focused on the Sunnis, but on the Shia side also, equally. You had many people of goodwill, and their goodwill was also deliberately sidelined by deliberately sectarian politicians, deliberately, who often always refer to sectarianism in order to deflect attention from their own failures. There are so many examples that I could cite. It's really appalling when you see the way they speak to each other publicly on Iraqi television.
But could you give us an example, perhaps, of, let's say, a influential Sunni politician or leader seriously advocating some kind of cross-sectarian alliance with Maliki state of law? Because I remember in 2009, the provincial elections, there were reports that Maliki had made overtures to the Sunni community, to Salah Mutlaq, I think, but the story was that this was torpedoed by the Jordanians or Saudi Arabia, I can't quite remember. But can you give us an example, perhaps, where there's been an episode of genuine cross-sectarian political alliance, let's say, or partnership even?
Sure. The Iraqi alliance, 2010, was the only cross-sectarian alliance, electoral alliance, as you know. It was the only one, right? And the Sunnis at the time voted for an electoral alliance that has at its head a Shia. Okay, so many people have said, oh, well, that was just a fiction and so on and so forth, but they did vote for it, right? At the time, they did. And many people on the other side voted for Maliki. There was a large segment of the Iraqi population, a clear majority, that voted for two political alliances that were campaigning on the basis of national unity, of moderation, anti-corruption, et cetera, right? What was expected at the time, what everyone was hoping for, is that those two alliances would merge, or not merge necessarily, but form a government. But instead, that never happened. Okay? Instead, it was de-Baathification, it was more corruption, it was more sectarianism, it was more human rights violations, arrests, et cetera, et cetera. That's what we got instead.
Out of the 91 seats Iraqi got, 12 of them came from the Shia South.
They came from the Shia South, but how many of those seats came from Baghdad, from Shia areas of Baghdad? That you'll never know.
And then if I can finish.
Sorry.
So 12 seats from the Shia South, and you mentioned that it included a Shia leader, Ayad Alawi. Sure. But I think it's well established that Ayad Alawi is seen as the more preferred Shia. He's less Shia than the others. And secondly, an individual or a politician who in Iraq's previous elections, I think came third and then was non-existent in the next 2005 elections. But can you seriously call Iraqi a cross-sectarian party, given that reality? Because I was in the South in 2010, and I'd speak to people in the South. I'd ask them, who would you vote for? And they'd say Alawi. So I think that vote was for Alawi, but not necessarily for Iraqi. And I think this distinction has to be made between Iraqi as a bloc, its identity being primarily Sunni Arab, and its figurehead Shia leader, Ayad Alawi. Whereas elsewhere it would be votes for the Dawah Party, state of law. So I think that distinction is important, because Iraqi's core identity is Sunni Arab. That's the essence of the point I'm making.
Excellent. Thank you. If I can just jump in, I'm sure this can continue for the next 10 minutes. If I could just throw the centre of gravity back out to the members and see if we can pick up some more. Yes, please, gentlemen. Fourth, fifth row there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Gary Kent from the all-party parliamentary group on the Kurdistan region. The Kurdistan region has been mentioned in passing, almost as if it's another country. And, of course, it is a distinct part of federal Iraq. I just wanted to invite both of you to imagine where Kurdistan is going to be. Can it dynamize as a gateway to the rest of Iraq, Iraq as a whole? Will it stay? Can it stay? Does it want to stay? Do people in Baghdad wish it to stay? Is it feasible for it to go? And the new relationship with Turkey, how is that going to change that possibility as the pipeline gets going, Kurdistan becomes a net contributor and therefore maybe decides that it's time to cut its losses? How do both of you see the next 5 years for the future of the Kurdistan region? Small question. In Iraq. Thank you very much.
What I would say just briefly is I would prefer the Kurdistan region to remain part of Iraq, mainly because I'm concerned about conflict. I don't see that the Kurdistan region has a lot to gain from separating from the rest of Iraq, particularly because the risk of conflict is very, very high. Separation without conflict, I think, is going to be very difficult. And I would prefer for there to be no more conflicts between those two peoples. That's my main concern. Another reason why is, from a purely human perspective, I don't see why we can't live together. I would consider that to be a failure of the human spirit if we weren't able to resolve our differences. And I think we can and we should. Right? Something else is that many people don't give this enough credit, is that since 2003, Iraqi Kurdistan is much more part of the rest of Iraq than it had been ever in the past, probably. The amount of exchange that takes place between Iraqi Kurdistan and the rest of the country is much greater than it's ever been. You have people that are flowing into Kurdistan to go on holiday, to work, to have operations done, to relax, etc., own property. Many people from Baghdad now own property in Iraqi Kurdistan. That's never been the case before. There's a lot more respect towards people in Kurdistan as well. Previously, racist jokes were very, very common. Now they're very rare. All that exchange has changed the relationship between the two areas, and I think that's something that can be built upon, and I think it should be built upon. Whether or not it will, and whether or not Iraqi Kurdistan will split apart, I really can't say. That'll depend on dynamics that one can't predict. But I would say that it would be a shame if we weren't able to live together in the future.
Yeah, and I think the Kurds are essentially concerned with making sure Iraq doesn't go back to the past, where the Kurds paid dearly in the hands of a brutal dictatorship in Baghdad. So they're concerned with the past, they're concerned with the present, because they want to build and continue to build on their economy, their vast energy resources, and they're concerned about the future because of the regional volatility. I don't think they'll choose independence anytime soon. It will always be on the table, I think, as an option, and only if the regional climate, the domestic climate in Iraq requires it. But again, you mentioned Turkey. It's highly unlikely Kurdistan would ever declare independence unless it had the patronage from Turkey.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Yes, please, down at the front.
My name is Euripides. I'm the High Commissioner of Cyprus. I live next door. 4.5 hours to go home, 4.5 seconds to come to Chatham House. Pleasure to be here.
You're welcome.
I know my question is yesterday's stories, but it's something that has been bugging me. And it's something that affects my thinking. Also talking about the past and how that affects us indirectly. In my previous life, I was ambassador in Washington during the Iraq war, Iraq invasion. And if my professors were to look at the cables that I sent from Washington back home on the situation on Iraq, I'm sure they would take my degree back because I did not exercise any critical thinking. In the end, it turned out that there was so much spin and hype where people did not really know what's going on. So much information and disinformation happening. Are there any lessons that we come from there for the future? I was looking at some things with a sense of déjà vu in the case of Iran. Thank God it hasn't moved in that direction. I do not know if it will move in the future. We're talking about empowering civil society. Just as we need it for Iraq, we need it here as well. So why should the civil society here, or in Iraq for that matter, should accept what is said at face value when many of the players simply lost every credibility in spoon-feeding the people the wrong thing? Thank you.
You mentioned civil society, so...
No, I think we have a major challenge, as I've already mentioned before. I'm not optimistic for the future. When I mentioned civil society before, I didn't mean to suggest that it was the solution that's going to bring prosperity to Iraq. What I meant to suggest, what I meant to say, was that civil society is the only hope currently that we have. Because the politicians have failed us, our system of government has failed us, the international community has failed us. When you have our prime minister who's being lauded around the world despite the terrible abuses that take place in the country. And incidentally, when you say he's the most popular politician in Iraq, I don't know what basis you get that from.
The previous elections.
The previous elections, okay.
Yeah.
In the 2013 elections, he didn't do so well. Okay. Anyway, in any event.
But you need specifics, though, so you can't really dismiss it just like that by how many thousands, by how many numbers.
Okay.
We'll come to that.
Okay, we'll come to that later. Okay. So we really don't have many options left, and the only option left that I see that could have any type of role is the little success that we've had that we can build on from civil society. The only positive developments that have taken place have come from civil society. So therefore, let's build upon that and try to get a little bit more, head a little bit more into the right direction through a more generalized strategy, as opposed to just targeting specific issues one by one. Right? That's the only hope that I can see, not for the next elections. The next elections, for me, I've completely written off. It's for 2018. That's what I'm setting my sights on.
I'm just too, perhaps I'm too skeptical or even cynical, but this idea of having a grand solution for Iraq, I think it's healthy to have the debate and the discussions, but I'm yet to kind of receive a convincing proposal as to how you bridge the gap, the animosity which I referred to in my presentation, because I think that's essentially it. This is the foundation on which the post-03 violence and conflict took place. And until I think that's resolved, then civil society initiatives, anything else beyond that is just ancillary.
Can I just say something very quickly?
Sure.
So the civil conflict that took place between 2005 and 2007 was much more violent than what's taking place now, right?
Yeah.
Levels of violence were 3 to 4 times higher than they are now, okay? And yet, after that terrible episode of violence, from 2008 all the way to 2011, there was a spirit of national reconciliation in the country, undeniable, undeniable.
And as I said in my
People-
presentation, though, there was a tactical retreat, because I think this is, again, one of the misconceptions. The Civil War didn't suddenly magically end after 2007. As I said earlier in my presentation, there was a retreat on the part of one community, and of course, I was careful to point out that the other side did not win any conflict. They simply contained the violence from the extreme elements emanating from the Sunni Arab community. It wasn't.
Well, you're talking
it
about
didn't end there.
You're talking about the armed elements. You're talking about the tiny percentage of the population that's actually participating in the fighting. Right?
Sure.
So, I can't speak about those people. I don't know how they're going to be behaving. I don't know whether they're all going to get crushed or killed or so on and so forth. What I'm talking about is the 98% of the population who are willing to reconcile and would be very happy to live in the same country and would be very happy to see a more prosperous country for themselves.
I agree. Yeah.
And on that note, I'd just like to thank both speakers for sticking to the time. That was fantastic. Both of you stayed within your 13 minutes. You gave very clear presentations, and you've been a dream to chair because the spark here is just fantastic. You should feel the electricity. It's magnificent here. So if you could just join me in thanking our speakers very much.